Welcome to another episode of LWJ Jeffrey Podcast. I'm Jeffrey Hernandez, your host, and today it is my honor to have in our studio Andrew Otazo, an individual who has turned humor into a tool of change, who has been resilient in moments of difficulty, and who has gone from cleaning the swamps and being an activist for the environmental protection to an influencer in the market world. And so today we're very happy to have with us someone who is not only a social media influencer and a supporter for marketing services to entrepreneurs, but is an entrepreneur himself, but also is a person that uses humor to make change in the world. Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation. A little bit about myself, sure. I was born and raised in Miami. At 18, I thought it was a good idea to join the Army, so I went off to West Point, spent 2 years there. Then I broke a shin and came back after receiving an honorable discharge. Then, let's see, I've done a lot of different things. I got my degree in political science from UM, as well as a master's degree in international administration. I lived in South America. I'm a native Spanish speaker. I'm Cuban American, but I picked up Portuguese when living in Brazil, lived in Buenos Aires. Then I went up to Boston, and I was hired as the assistant to former Mexican President Felipe Calderón, who had started a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School. I also worked as a researcher at HKS. When he went back to Mexico, I then went over to Harvard Business School, and I was hired as a case writer. So I wrote basically the foundation of their whole teaching philosophy. I have 17 academic publications. Then I was up there because my girlfriend was at Harvard Law School. And when she graduated, I was like, all right, I'm done with the cold, or at least I thought I was. So I came down here and I worked at a startup for a little while. And then, I forgot. I also worked at the U.S. State Department before I went up to Boston. So that was the first time in D.C. I worked in the Office of Andean Affairs, primarily in the Venezuela desk. Then I was hired when I came back from Boston as the executive director of the Cuba Study Group, which does Cuba policy and advocacy in DC. So I had to move back to DC. I spent 3 years there working on the Hill, doing media, literally doing everything for the organization. Then I came back to Miami. I wrote a very silly book called The Miami Creation Myth. And I worked at several different public relations agencies, specifically Jeffrey Group and Kivit. And then about a year ago, I started my own public relations agency, and I've been at that ever since. Oh, and on my free time, I've picked up 24,000 pounds of trash from South Florida's coastal ecosystem. So mangroves, the Everglades, down at the Keys, all over the place.
Let me ask Andrew, first of all, you have a diversified experience in such a short life. How old are you?
I'm 36.
That talks about, there's something to be said about having all these kinds of experiences as you find your path in life.
Right.
Would you say that those experiences have really allowed you to be comfortable with what you're doing currently?
Absolutely. It goes all the way back to West Point, like being comfortable in uncomfortability, or being outside your element, because at the end of the day, no matter how hard something gets or how much stress it puts on me as an individual, I can always look back and be like, well, at least my shin isn't broken and I'm not walking up a bunch of mountains with 60 pounds of gear on my back. So I have the knowledge that I've been in situations where it was either extremely difficult or, like, for instance, when I was hired at Harvard Business School, I had no business background whatsoever. And I essentially had to Google my way to an MBA because I was writing the materials on very esoteric topics for literally the world's most intelligent students and professors. And if I'm writing a case study on, for example, something I have no background in, so like the FDA approval process, that's going to be taught to a class full of MD PhDs. And if I get anything wrong, I'm going to get eviscerated. So I have to make sure that's right. So I'm very comfortable in very quickly getting up to speed on something I know nothing about and then become at least a working expert in it.
Let me ask you, you were in the Army.
Yeah.
You got discharged because you had an accident. That Army experience has to have been magical in preparing you for the world of entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. What skills would you say you gathered in the Army that now as an entrepreneur have made you a better one?
A couple. There's softer skills like grit, which is very hard to teach in a course. Just that ability to push through difficulties and not just push through it, but not get flustered by it. So that when you're in a high pressure situation, you keep your cool and you make good rational decisions.
And as an entrepreneur, you're going to be in high pressure situations
all the time.
What
Yes.
else did you learn?
Organization. So just thinking about tackling what seem to be large problems methodically, breaking them down into smaller pieces, and then going after them one after the other in sequence until, the way to eat a whale, as the idiom goes, is one bite at a time. So just being able to do that in a methodical way.
Let me ask you, leadership is so important in today's world, and it's lacking in many individuals because they quickly open a business, but don't realize that opening a business is just the first step, but leading the people to be able to execute what the business is having as a vision takes a lot of work.
Yes.
In your Army experience, did you extract leadership that you're now currently using? And if so, what was that?
So specifically the brand of leadership that I subscribe to is, not a pithy LinkedIn quote, right? It's sure you need to inspire people you work with, but I feel like leadership at the end of the day, the type of leadership that I like and that I practice is you lead from the front, which means that that just means that you put in so much more work than everybody else because you are so passionate about what you're pursuing. And it's not because you want to self-aggrandize or anything like that. It's because you just want to see the mission fulfilled. And so you're willing to put in that work, and then hopefully other people will see you doing so and take inspiration from that. That's the type of leadership that I subscribe to.
I'm sitting here and I feel I have a smile on my face because it's been a long time since I heard someone talk about the fact that as a leader, you're going to work harder than anyone else, and you're doing it because you have the passion, you believe in it, and it's not really a chore. It's actually a passion and fun, right? It's nice to hear that you as a young entrepreneur are in the same mindset that yields those results. Let me ask you, you had a very non-traditional way to gain these skills. So something that I really want to highlight is the fact that as a listener, you don't have to go to business school to get leadership or business skills. In every experience that you're going to be engaging in life, you should be looking for what you're learning from that experience. And that's why, as you heard from Andrew, in his Army experience, he learned things that today as an entrepreneur have enriched his ability to be successful. So again, I want to make sure that as you're going through life, you are looking for those opportunities that are going to empower you to be different and to be powerful. Andrew, you then went to another experience that must have been significant in your life, and that's you were the assistant to the president of Mexico.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about that. That's like cool.
That was crazy. Because first of all, I didn't know what I was applying for because they didn't exactly publicize the fact that Felipe Calderon was, at the Harvard Kennedy School because for his own safety, really, because there are a lot of people that wanted to hurt him or his family. So the job listing was simply former Latin American policymaker. And I applied to it. I basically, like, on a whim applied to it. I almost didn't. And when I came into the HR office to talk about it, the woman behind the desk was like, "Oh, I see you applied for this position." I was like, yeah, I don't know if I really want it. And then she said, "Oh, it's for Felipe Calderon." And my jaw literally dropped because I had studied his policies in graduate school and undergrad, like very, very deeply. And I was like, yes, I want that job. What do I have to do? And then the interview process itself, it was down to me and two other people. And I came into his office, which, like, if you speak to a former head of state, is very intimidating. And I was like, screw it. And I only spoke to him in Spanish. And I talked about his policies as president, which I had studied, and what I knew about Mexico's economy and society, and different sides of Mexican culture. and what I agreed with and didn't agree with in terms of some of his decision making his process, which, you know, coming from like a 24-year-old, like what does this guy care what I think? But he wound
You
up
were 24 when you
Yes.
were hired? Wow.
Yes, actually, wait, no, 25. I'm sorry. And he hired me, and
What an honor.
yes, it was incredible. But also, he went from a staff of 200 to me, and I had never worked for this. This is what I'm talking about when I say that I keep finding myself in positions that I had no preparation for, but I had to drink out of a fire hose and quickly understand that learning curve and get to the top of it as quickly as possible.
But you know, Andrew, that point that you're making right now is so important for our listeners, because there's a lot of individuals that are either opening their own business or entering employment in someone else's business, and use the lack of skills or experience in a particular area as an excuse for them not completing the task. And what I hear from you is, you got to drink the water. You got to do whatever it takes. Google it, find it, but you're going to have to catch up, because at the end, that cannot be an excuse for not doing the work.
Yeah. So I remember specifically, so I used to manage all of his correspondence with everyone, with the Mexican government, with heads of state, with his friends, with his children's schools. And I remember I got a letter from Michel Martelly, who at the time was the prime minister of Haiti. And I was like, oh, you know, he wrote you a letter. He's like, oh, respond to the letter. And he asked me, how's your French? And I'm like, not very good. And he's like, well, respond to it anyway. And it's just like, figure it out. What do I care? This isn't my problem. So I had to write a letter in French to this head of state, despite speaking very little French. And I used every trick that I had. I called up my Haitian friends. I used Google Translate, which in 2014 wasn't that great.
You got to be resourceful, right?
Right. And I almost caused a couple of diplomatic incidents in a few occasions, but I figured it out and I fixed it, and I worked nights and weekends, and I was terrified of my phone, because at any moment I could get a phone call from him and I could have screwed something up royally. But I figured it out, and I remained his assistant until he left for Mexico again.
And let me ask you, that work that you did as his assistant, now as an entrepreneur of your own business, what skills did you learn in that era that helped you be who you are today?
First and foremost, it kind of, again, leaning on West Point as well. Like, I've had a head of state and I've had generals yell at me. And if someone else, and therefore, if someone else is in this, I don't get flustered. Like, if I walk into a boardroom and I'm surrounded by Fortune 500 executives, I'm like, okay, whatever. What are you going to do? Haze me? So I can always fall back on, I've been in way more stressful situations and been receiving incoming from way more important individuals. So you can't shake me. There was that aspect to it. And then there's also the aspect of, I love this phrase. And it's very simple. It came from West Point. It's figure it out. I remember I would have this seemingly insurmountable problem, and this major or this colonel would just I would explain, oh, I can't do this because X, Y, or Z. And they just shrug their shoulders and be like, figure it out. And so it's just there's a solution out there. Go find it. I don't care how you get to it. That's not my problem. That's your problem. It
created, from what I'm hearing, a sense of independence in doing your work.
Yes.
And it also created a tolerance for feedback.
Yes.
Which is a skill set that as a leader we need. And also as a leader, we need to provide for others, right? Because nowadays, a lot of people don't like to hear feedback or personalized feedback, and then avoid the growth that comes from feedback, right? Let me ask you, in those experiences that you had, understanding that now you're an entrepreneur, what are you doing differently for the people that work for you as a result of those two experiences?
So I'm human, so I'm not always, I fail sometimes at doing this, but when it comes to specifically my creative work or my work with my clients, I set my ego aside. I try to. I want to make the best possible deliverable that helps achieve whatever goal we have for that project. So I'll give you an example. So when I wrote the Miami Creation Myth, the book, I reached out to 25 different individuals from all sorts of different communities here in Miami because I didn't just want to write this book from a Cuban American perspective. And a lot of them had feedback to the effect of, you got this completely wrong. This is how you should have written this, because that's how they experienced living in their communities, which I'm not a member of. And I said, okay. So like I rewrote entire chapters of the book based on their experiences because I'm not interested in fluffing my own ego. I'm interested in writing the best possible book that best reflects the lived experiences of other people. And I do that. I try to bring that also to my professional work. I have my skill sets and I have my expertise, so I will give you my opinion on, what I believe are best practices. But again, that's all in service to producing the best possible product. So feedback to me is not personal. It's let's just shape this product to the best of our abilities and make it as good as possible.
So it seems that powerful statements and more importantly, lessons that our listeners need to understand. One, don't look at feedback as a lack of validation or value for your work.
Right.
Look at feedback as the beginning to
Right.
growth, which is very important. I heard from you also that it's really critical that you understand that the task that has to be completed, whether you have the immediate skills to complete it or not, that's not an excuse for not completing it.
Yep.
And that you need to become resourceful to be able to find the things you need to meet the deadlines
Right.
and the deliverables. I also heard from you that when you are working for someone, you have to understand that their style is the one you're going to have to accommodate to, and that it is not them who has to change to you.
Right.
And how you deal with that is your own business, right? You got to make sure that works. But I like the fact that you've taken those experiences, including the grit you learned from in the Army, and that you've put it together in a package leadership towards the people that work for you now.
Right.
Let me ask you, Army, assistant to the president of Mexico, and then you continue policy work and you went somewhere else and did that work. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Also State Department. So foreign policy, like that's the peak of foreign policy. I always gravitated toward that because, it's not just policy related, but basically everything in my life. I like to fill in the blank spaces in the proverbial map. So when it came to foreign policy, that's literally, I committed the geographic location, capital city, economic data, and basic history of all 198 countries on the planet. And that was fascinating to me, putting together those different puzzles, or those different pieces to create a whole puzzle. And so, yeah, that was my bread and butter for a long time. But,
did you enjoy doing the policy part?
Absolutely.
What do you enjoy most about that? Because that's a unique task, a unique job to be in charge of creating the policies that people are going to have to follow.
It's understanding there's a top level understanding of foreign policy, which is you have like these different schools of thought, whether it's realism or idealism or constructivism, where this is the paradigm that people think in and this is why they make the decisions that they make. But that's not what I found. I found that whether it's people working in foreign ministries or the U.S. State Department or different ambassadors or heads of state, they're not thinking to themselves, well, I'm a realist and therefore I have to fit this problem into this philosophical paradigm that I have ascribed to. No, that's not how it works. It's, there's a fire, I need to put out the fire. How do I put out the fire? And understanding how different cultural experiences and idiosyncrasies and even language. So, I speak English, Spanish, and Portuguese, a little bit of French, and within these different languages, there are entire concepts that do not translate. And so there's the possibility that the person on the other side of a table literally can't communicate to you, and it's not their fault, it's not your fault, a fundamental principle that is shaping their thought process. So trying to get a grasp of how different people in positions of power think and why they make certain decisions, that was always the most fascinating part of foreign policy to me.
So the fact of being able to absorb how people are thinking and incorporate that into policy, definitely.
You also need to understand their history. You need to understand aspects of their history, their culture, their economy, their language, all these different aspects that form.
It's complex.
Yes, extremely complex. And I love that.
And from that experience, what leadership or entrepreneurship skill did you extract that you apply now in your current business?
Empathy.
Wow.
And people use empathy sometimes as a very wishy-washy kind of almost like
a weakness.
Yes. And like you have to love the person that you're in conflict with, but that's not what real empathy is. Empathy is being able to, at least to a certain extent, place yourself inside that person's head and it's understanding. Why are they making this decision? What are the emotions going into it? What is, again, in what they teach in a lot of graduate programs that focus on foreign policy is like, oh, everyone is, a perfectly rational actor. That's not the case. There are all sorts of different factors that go into decision making, everything from how tired they are to how emotionally vulnerable they feel to, again, their cultural and linguistic background. So trying to put yourself in the head of someone else, even if you completely disagree with them, to understand why they come up with the decisions that they do.
I call it the root cause. I think part of being an empathetic leader is having the skill set to identify the root cause in those individuals that work with you, so that you can actually help them overcome the challenge that they're confronting that's obstacleizing their ability to perform. I always, as a leader myself, say, I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and wants to fail. And so if you really are an empathetic leader, you're constantly searching for the why. Why are they not performing at the level that they should be? I mean, fascinating, diversified experience. You go from army to assistant to to the president to policymaker, and then you write a book.
Yeah.
Tell me about that author experience and what led you to that.
This is another
because it doesn't connect to everything else.
I know. This is just another example of me doing something that, ostensibly I have no right to do because I have no background in. So yeah,
which seems to be a trend in your life, right?
Absolutely. I'm like, oh, let me just make another, 180-degree turn, over and over and over again. But I had written specifically satire, for a while. Nothing serious. I would write short stories and articles and just keep them for myself. But then, I started writing about my experiences as a Cuban American, as someone from Miami, and I just decided that I've also been, again, this is part of my personal education into trying to empathize with other cultures. I've always been very interested in mythology. So whether that's ancient Egyptian or Greek, or Han Chinese or different indigenous groups, I've always loved to understand how people build the universe around them, how they understand.
That was one class in high school that I always loved to go to when we were studying mythology, Egyptian culture. That I'm fascinated.
Yes. So you understand my own fascination with it. And then I thought to myself, well, Miami is so weird and so unique that it deserves its own mythos. It deserves its own pantheon of gods and goddesses. And I just wrote this ridiculous story about how Pachango the creator wakes up on a divine bing bang boom and creates the universe, and his children, Yamilet, the goddess of the sky, Marislaisis, the goddess of the Everglades, and Achepe, the god of cheese.
But it's been a hit.
Yes, it has been a hit. But that's not how it started. It started with one story. And I don't know how it happened. I had no right to be published, but it got published in Acentos Review, which is one of the premier Latino literary journals in the United States, which I thought was hilarious because I was next to like these really important poets writing really important poetry about really important things. And then there's like a story where Casa Pinga, Casa El Carajo, and Casa Culo are literal houses at the ends of the universe in my story. So here I am. And then I was like, okay, well, let's turn this into something else. So I approached my friend Danny Mendoza and I said, who's a director, can we turn this into a short film? He laughed at me. He goes, haha, no, there's no money in that. Go write a whole book and maybe we'll turn it into a TV series, which is just his way of telling me to go away. And I was like, you have no idea who I am. So I said yes, and I wrote a whole book. And I wrote all these different chapters explaining universe building, essentially. How did the sun and moon and stars come to be? How did different different groups of people come to Miami? And then I published the book after 7 years, after of intense collaboration with all these different individuals from all sorts of different communities, whether it's Haitian American, Jamaican, Central American, Argentine, undocumented, and incorporating their experiences into the book. And then after being told by so many different publishing houses, your book is very funny, you're a very good writer, but it's too niche, they didn't want to take a risk essentially on this book. I said, screw it, I'm going to do it myself. And I spent those 7 years building a grassroots base to sell the book to, using highly shareable content, using specifically memes and satirical articles. Think a la The Onion, for example. And so after building this base of like 35,000 followers and collaborating with 25 different actors on the audiobook, including people like Jenny Lorenzo, who people in Miami might know, I published it myself. And I not only did I, again, I work in public relations. So I went hardcore into getting earned media. So I was in the Miami Herald, I was in WLRN, I was on the Dan Le Batard show, I was in literally every single local media outlet.
So I guess any business owner out there listening to us should definitely hire you, because
Sure.
if you can get your own stuff into all these publications, you can help the business owners get their name out there.
Right. If I can get this silly book into to get Billy Corbin to talk about it on air with Dan Le Batard, then yes, that's...
But let me ask you, so you take humor and you use it to make change happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in this book, obviously humor is a prerequisite because it's a unique combination of Cuban history and Cuban culture and the Greek mythology and
Sure.
other things. So are you a naturally humorous person? Is sense of humor something that you...
Oh, I'm hilarious all the time. No, clearly not. I don't know. I've personally, when I write anything, it turns into satire, whether I want it to or not. That's just my instinct. I'm a huge fan of the old masters of satirical writing. Jonathan Swift being the OG, or Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I just love it so much because I think the world is absurd. And when you point out that absurdity by just slightly dialing up how crazy everybody is and everything is, that's just satire. You're just showing a slightly warped mirror to people. But you brought up a good point, because I think there is an excellent intersection between advocacy and humor. So, I just spent 3 days at the Aspen Climate Conference here in Miami.
Wow.
And they bring in all sorts of different experts from around the world, and mayors and policymakers, and they put them up on stage, and they, it's extremely boring. They are talking about a really, really important topic, and everyone's on their phones or on their computers or not really paying attention. And so I use humor as kind of like the sugar that lets the medicine go down. So, like, for instance, I did at the Miami Book Fair, I was put on a climate panel, and I dressed up as a croqueta. And so did my friend Mario Riza, who is a climate reporter. We were two croquetas, Like, think a cardboard cutout of a croqueta with a hole for your face.
I think a lot of our listeners, now you can see your Halloween costumes that you can come up with anything.
Yeah,
Right? Can you imagine getting to a place dressed up as a croqueta?
Yeah.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, and people are like, what in the world is this about? They were listening to me. I was talking about very important topics in a very silly manner, and they were listening. They were engaged. Everybody was laughing. They weren't on their phones. And so if you can engage with people, because also I knew my audience. This is a Miami audience, and they see someone dressed as a croqueta. If I were in Wisconsin, I would be like, what is he doing?
Yeah.
But here in Miami, I know that they would think that's funny.
Well, you have to have something that when you're going to do something like that, you have to make sure it relates to the audience. Because if you do it in a place where the audience takes it in the wrong way, it doesn't work out. The book that you wrote, when you did it, what was your intention with it? What was the moral intention that you had with it?
I wanted Miamians to first of all, as a Miamian, as a Cuban American, I don't see my story told very often in a way that isn't like Miami Vice or Scarface. It's told by outsiders for the consumption of outsiders. It basically turns Miami into like a packaged product that they can consume. Oh, sex, bikinis, cocaine, Miami. That's not Miami for Miamians. That is not our experience. I don't remember the last time I went to Miami Beach. I literally don't know the last time I stepped foot on sand in Miami Beach.
There's no time.
No, there's no time. And so I wanted to reflect Miami back to Miamians in a way that they would look at it and go, oh, that's right. And I wanted to do that for all sorts of different communities, not just my community. And that was always the ultimate goal.
So trying to connect with all the cultures, but at the same time bringing back the truth around what it is to be a Miami.
Yeah. It's not easy to live in this city. That's a fact.
But it's the best city. I mean, I travel the world and for business and for pleasure. And when I get to the airport of Miami, I'm like, it feels home.
You get that blast of humidity walking out of Miami International?
Even despite as hot as it is.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, so you have, I mean, it's fascinating, right? But now you also are engaged in a lot of work around protecting the swamps.
Yeah.
I know that when I was getting to know you, you shared the passion you have for cleaning the swamps. Mm-hmm. And there's so many people out there that have the passion for changing the way people protect the environment or protecting the environment themselves and don't know how. And you have found a way to do everything else you do and still have time for that. Tell us about that journey.
So it started out of frustration. I've always loved the mangroves. Mangroves are a very important ecosystem in South Florida. They act as shock absorbers. Whenever there's a hurricane, they absorb all that water so it doesn't go into our streets, it doesn't go into our houses, and they are a keystone habitat. So think something like 90% of the reef fish that you'll find offshore have their juvenile phases within the roots of the mangroves. And they're very important for local coastal birds as well, and all sorts of different animals. And I would go, growing up here in Miami, I would go into these mangrove forests and I would seek like solitude and solace and peace. And as I got older, I continued to visit them. And I would get, when I came out, rather than feeling at peace with myself and happy, I'd be furious because they looked like landfills. Like, it's not an exaggeration to say that you couldn't take a single step anywhere without stepping on trash, specifically plastic. And then 7 years ago, I decided, almost like enraged, like kind of raging against the machine or screaming into the void, that I myself would pick up this trash, like one piece at a time. And I just happened to bring a GoPro with me, and I started recording what I was doing, and I fell into this by accident. I never thought anybody would care. Nobody would care about what I was doing. And to my shock, people engaged with it.
Oh, of course.
They didn't know it was such a big problem. They didn't know its root sources. And just because, here's another lesson that I've learned, that a big part of making real societal change is just sticking to something, even when it's difficult, even when you feel like nothing's being accomplished, you just keep working at it.
But that's also a leadership trait, if you think about it, Andrew, because as a CEO, sometimes in order to enact change within your team or within your organization, it's the persistency on what you believe and not letting the resistance or the lack of engagement to deteriorate your path, right? And to stay focused. And I think in what you're mentioning right now, it's true. To enact change, you have to be willing to be persistent beyond time, beyond the availability of time, and beyond the resistance that you're going to face or lack of change, right? Because change takes a while. It's not going to happen overnight. But you cleaning these swamps, you're making sure that the environment is taken care of, but you're utilizing a skill that you naturally have to make it not only true for what you're doing, but reach out to others to make it true in their environment.
Absolutely.
And so you're using your marketing skills to do that. Can you share a little bit about how you go about doing that?
Absolutely. So the point, so I love specifically this one area called Bearcut Preserve, which is on the northern end of Key Biscayne. So when I pick up that area, when I pick up the trash there, I'm making a local difference, but I'm not tackling the problem at a systemic level. I cleaned up the same stretch of mangroves dozens and dozens of times because at every high tide, there's more trash. So the point was never just to pick up that area and then I was done. It was essentially an ongoing public relations campaign. It was me documenting my work using video, posting it online, and then getting attention to it so that I can help build that grassroots base of support that would then push policymakers to address the problem at its source. And that included a lot of different collaboration with all sorts of different organizations. So it started off me by myself, just picking up trash. But I've worked with the Girl Scouts, Frost Museum of Science, Miami Freedom Project. I don't even know how many middle and high schools.
So that time with the president and with the policymaker job really helped you in this aspect because they gave you a lot of that networking skill set.
Absolutely.
And I don't know when you started the initiative, but it used to be a time where social media was not as impactful as it is now, but it is very impactful now. Are you using social media to help you? And if so, how?
Every day. Absolutely. Because that allows me, again, to build that core group of support that I then want to push policymakers. And this has been, this project will go on until, I physically can't continue picking up trash. But it has allowed me into spaces that I had previously no business being in to educate people. So I have, I have a recurring lecture series on grassroots organizing and environmental activism that I've done at Clemson, at Cornell, at University of Miami, at MDC, at FIU, and all sorts of local middle and high schools. I love talking to students. I do it all the time. And also it gives me entree into these different spaces that I wouldn't otherwise be able to be in to talk about this problem. So talking to policymakers, our local commissioners, state representatives, even at the federal level, but also, again, this panel I was on Wednesday, if I hadn't done this, I would never be able to be on that panel and talk about this problem. Or I'm always I have a books and books panel coming up. It's a constant or completely full calendar of opportunities to educate. Yes, to educate people. Yes, through different venues.
It's an educational campaign, and this work you're doing right now requires a different type of leadership skill. What would you say is the leadership skill that you would say you need to highlight in you and hold true to being strong in you during this process?
Well, obviously the first one is perseverance. Just keep at it. Because I found, again, through policy, through different aspects of my life, that the organizations and the individuals that tend to be the most successful are just the ones that have stuck to their initiative for the longest, because there are inevitably ups and downs. There will always be downs, and you have to be ready for that. And the thing is that when you're on the upcycle, whether it's for political reasons or economic reasons or just the general zeitgeist is interested in a specific problem that you're working on, everybody pours into that sector. Everybody wants to work on it. But when the down cycle comes, everybody leaves and goes on to do other things because they feel like their time can be better spent doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
I've stuck to this, like,
regardless of the time.
Exactly.
That's amazing. You know, and it's interesting because you've had a very diversified experience in your career thus far, in your professional life and in your life period. And from each experience, you've been able to extract different types of skills.
Mm-hmm.
And now you've put all of those together and you are a business owner of your own entrepreneurship project, and it deals with marketing and helping organizations with the right communication strategy.
Right.
Tell us a little bit, what's the name of your company, and tell us a little bit about that.
It's called ARO Communications, and it's basically a full suite of communications and public relations strategies and products.
Are you by yourself, or you have a team?
So I'm by myself, but I can lean on a whole constellation of individuals that have skill sets that I don't have. So whether that's graphic design, or that's video production, or social media management, or even other public relations professionals that can help me take on larger projects.
Would you define your entity as an one-stop network, or is it a type of business that the owners that hire you have to have other people that they hire to support the work?
I have a very large network of different people within, like, the larger communication sphere that I can tap into to basically do whatever needs to happen. So whether that's creating, producing a literal ad, so getting actors, getting a director, getting videographer, editing, all that stuff, to, again, social media management, so the day-to-day of scheduling out posts and the strategy that involves. I have that network that I can tap into. But what's my personal bread and butter is building a communication strategy. So from scratch. So figuring out how you're going to present yourself to your sector and to your potential clients so that they would want to hire you. Building that brand from scratch that's for me the most interesting part.
The business brand, the personal brand, or both?
Both. So it depends on what kind of client you have and what their goals are. So first of all, as I always say, you start with the end. So what is your client's ultimate goal? What is it to change policy? Is it business development? Is it getting more clients? Is it as simple as raising the valuation of their company before going public or selling to another entity? It all depends. So then you create that communication strategy around that business end goal. That's it. Communications is always in service to the business goals of the company, or whatever client you have. And then you, like, say it's gaining more clients or business development in general, then that would then dictate what strategy you pursue. So are you doing an executive position strategy where you take, for example, the CEO, and you place them in high profile situations where they can elevate the brand within their target audience? So it could be as esoteric as, which I've done, chief technology officers of Fortune 500 companies, or state representatives, within a specific region, and then comes so there's the strategy building portion, which is ensuring that you create the key messages. I know I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here, but you create essentially the messages that will...
but you're helping the listeners, because a lot of people hear communication strategy but don't really understand what that means. And we have a lot of young entrepreneurs and business leaders that may have never had to create a communication strategy. And it's so important because in a moment of crisis, it's your saving grace.
Absolutely.
And in a moment of success, it's also you telling the right story, because
Exactly.
everyone's going to have a story told. It's either going to be you're going to be in control of it, or someone's going to tell it for you. And the choice is how proactive you become. So I think by you sharing the communication strategy process, it's really important. So far I've heard that you have to understand who you're communicating to.
Yes.
And what value you're going to bring
What's the ultimate goal
to the community that you're trying to create and you're trying to communicate to.
Right.
What's next?
And so the way that you do that is you create your key messages. So what are the 4 or 5 messages that you want your audience to hear over and over and over again, so that you build that brand? Who are you?
You're reminding me, I when I started this effort to educate and to empower the world to be able to enact change, in some of the reels that I've done, I always say, stop, don't scroll. And now everywhere I go, people find that's everyone, they see me and the first thing they do is stop, don't scroll.
That's good branding.
And it's so funny because I never thought it was going to be so impactful. And it wasn't even something I planned. It was just something that naturally came out in a reel, because I visualized, people just scroll up and down. And if you really want them to hear your message, they got to stop and they can't scroll.
Right.
And so now that I'm hearing you got to come up with a branding for it. And like another one for me is stay inspired. I always use that because I believe in the inspiration in the world. So you're right. You have to come up with that 4 or 5 things that identify your brand.
Right.
Do you feel, Forbes most recently cited that building a personal brand in 2024 is the most important priority for business owners, particularly the senior leaders in an organization, because the moment someone's trying to hire you, they're going to look at your company and the personal brand of the leader. What's your take on that?
I think that there needs to be a balance. I think depending on what kind of company you have, a personal brand can be extremely important. So, you think of the quintessential personal brand, Apple, right? Steve Jobs. He was the reason that he took a middling company and he made it a world-class company.
He will always be the reason why Apple is successful.
Right, exactly. It was his design aesthetic and his philosophy that made it such a successful company.
In my mind, when I think of Apple, I think of Steve Jobs.
Yeah, as you should.
I never separate the two, and no matter who's leading it now, I always think of Steve Jobs when I think of Apple.
Right. So that is important in many different companies. But also you want to build the company brand. So you want to transfer some of that brand power from the CEO to the company itself, so that when you're sitting across the table from potential clients and they're like, okay, you as a CEO, you're the reason why we're hiring you, but we trust that you have inculcated the rest of your senior staff and your junior staff with enough of your essence and your philosophy and your thoughtfulness that we will hire you without necessarily having to ensure that you are the one leading every single project, because you as a CEO are being pulled in a million different directions and you can't do everything. You have to rely on a team, and you have to ensure that your personal brand might pull in that client, but then the client will remain or will trust your company as the brand, not just you as a person.
I think that people, using Apple as an example, people bought Apple because they knew whoever Steve Jobs had working for him was going to be of quality, if not better, right? They were going to be like him or better, because he had such high standards in the brand he communicated and the outcomes. I mean, I still listen to inspirational recordings of Steve Jobs, and I read his book. It was an amazing, and you relate to it. So it's important that, like you said, the CEO pulls the client, but they have to have the trust that CEO is going to have the team prepared to deliver the service.
Exactly.
That happens in my company. I feel that a lot of people hire our company because they know of the expertise we bring to the table, and more importantly, that the team that I have around me is going to be of the same caliber or better. And I think that's part of branding an organization, so I can relate to that. Last but not least, you have gone through all of these different things. You're an entrepreneur now. You have marketing. You were the assistant to the president. You are an activist. You clean up swamps. You are trying to enact change in the world. You were in the army. You're an author. You use humor to make change. You think of the world very differently. You look at it through the world being not normal, right? And unique. And all of these things have created you. If you had to describe what those life lessons have been that have come to who you are today, what would be the top two?
Constantly challenge yourself. And that's paired up with you always have to continue learning. A lot of people think of education as, okay, I went to high school, then I went to college, and then my formal education's over, and then I took on essentially a trade, whether that's a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, or a mechanic, and you learn the basics of that trade in order to be successful, and then you're done. You just keep plugging away ad infinitum, and that's your life. You're done learning, and you're done putting yourself in situations that are difficult in which you would learn more. I take the polar opposite approach. I am constantly looking to learn about entire industries I know nothing about, and that philosophy isn't just intellectual; it's physical as well. I'm an endurance athlete. In 2019, I took 35 pounds of mangrove trash, strapped it onto my back, and walked the length of the Miami Marathon. And I got a front page story in the Miami Herald out of it. And in order to educate people, but also I love the intersection of physical and intellectual challenges. And I'm constantly doing crazy things. So a couple weeks ago, I biked 114 miles all the way around Lake Okeechobee on gravel and dirt and some asphalt.
Wow.
It took me 17 hours to do it. And I'm so happy when I am physically or emotionally just like destroyed at the end of a long challenge. And I was like, wow, I really accomplished something. So that is one of my key takeaways for sure.
Excellent. Well, as we reach the end of our podcast, I want to take an opportunity to highlight for our listeners some of the great things that today in this podcast, which I think was really meaty, can offer you as the listener. One, diversification in your life experiences is a must. It makes you an individual that is multifaceted and filled with a lot of lessons that you can utilize as you continue your journey. And more importantly, as you reach that financial freedom and financial stability that everyone's looking for. Today, he's an entrepreneur, but one day he was in the U.S. Army learning from so many leaders and so many skill sets that he was taking from. Don't ever underestimate that in any circumstance in your life, you can learn something from, whether it's a life lesson or a leadership trait. You can learn by paying attention to those details that sometimes may seem insignificant to some people, but in reality can make the greatest change in your life. Third, never be fearful to go apply for a job you know nothing about, because the unknown may be the best experience of your life. Notice he went to apply for a job, didn't realize he was going to be the assistant to the president of Mexico. And when he got there, he wasn't so sure he wanted the job. But if he would never have gone, he would never have had the opportunity to work there. And how many skills he would have not had the opportunity to learn. And today, he may not have been sitting where he's sitting. So never underestimate the value of going into the unknown, because at some point, that unknown may be your best success story. Also, don't ever underestimate the value of an unnecessary skill set in a time that it may not seem necessary. Sometimes we take a class and we say, what am I going to use this class for? But you never realize that at some point it may come in handy. And taking that class may change your life. For some people, it may be a language. For some people, it may be a skill. Never stop learning, and make sure you always are taking the advantage of learning things that are outside your traditional day-to-day. How many skills did he learn that contributed to what he's doing today in his current business? Can you be an entrepreneur and still have other passions? 100%. He runs a company. He just biked 114 miles. He's an activist and is cleaning up swamps. Entrepreneurship does not strap your life from being multifaceted and being able to do fun things. It's how you manage your time that makes a difference. And something I heard throughout this entire podcast is you don't have to have everything figured out. It's okay to not have the answers for everything. It's okay to face a problem and not have any idea how you're going to solve it, because the solution will present itself if you listen to the whispers of destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my privilege to be part of this activity today, be part of this episode, to host such an incredible human being that not only is intellectually at an all-time high, you are emotionally at an all-time high, and more importantly, you have a soul of an angelic energy. So thank you so much for everything you do for the world, for making us laugh in a time in which stress, as you said, pressure is everywhere, and for being here today and educating our listeners with a different perspective of life. Thank you for being with us today, and stay inspired.